What no one tells you about Hamnet is that the movie, the book, and the real history do not line up. And those differences completely change what you think this story is about. Now, we all know Hamlet as Shakespeare's great tragedy, but hardly anyone talks about the real boy, Hamnet Shakespeare, whose death may have inspired it. Now, the 2025 film adaptation and Maggie O'Farrell's novel take that idea and try to fill in the blanks. And it hits differently depending on which version you experience first. So by the end of this video, you'll know what really happened, what the novel created to fill in the blanks, what the film changed from the book, and why that final performance quietly rewrites how you see Shakespeare's play Hamlet and even Maggie O'Farrell's book. So I'll break this down into 5 parts. I'll do an ending explained, cover the real history of Shakespeare and his family, the biggest book versus movie changes, the Hamlet play Easter eggs and parallels, and what it all really means. Plus, I'll share whether you should read the book, watch the movie, or do both. Now let's start with the thing everyone wants first, the ending. First, let's walk through the movie's ending step by step, because there are 3 key moments that quietly change everything, especially if you've read the book. Now, Agnes, played by Jessie Buckley, has just lived through the unthinkable. Her son Hamnet dies after he effectively trades places with his twin sister Judith during an outbreak of pestilence. William isn't home, he doesn't make it back in time, and that rupture between them, the grief, the silence, the blame, that becomes the emotional fault line of the entire film. Now fast forward years later, William has buried himself in his work in London with the acting company. Agnes is still carrying this raw, open grief back in Stratford, and she hears he's written a play called Hamlet, a name that historically was a common variant of Hamnet in Stratford records. So she goes to the Globe to see the play. She walks in expecting, well, who knows what? Maybe a tribute, maybe a betrayal. And at first, the play seems to have nothing to do with her son at all. She's confused, she's angry, she wants to leave. And then the ghost appears. And then Hamlet steps up onto the stage. So there are 3 key moments that occur. Key moment number 1 is the casting. The actor playing Hamlet looks like Hamnet because the movie cast the Jupe brothers deliberately. We have Jacoby Jupe playing Hamnet earlier in the film, and Noah Jupe playing Hamlet later on. The resemblance is intentional, and the moment Agnes recognizes her child in that actor, the entire performance becomes an emotional collision between memory and grief. Key moment number 2 is Hamlet's death. So when Hamlet dies on stage, Agnes instinctively reaches out to him from the audience, her body reacting like a mother watching her son die all over again. And the film really pushes this further by having the entire audience reaching out with her. So it's not just her grief, it's the wave of the communal embodied in mourning at that time. And key moment number 3 is the in-between space, because throughout the film, we've seen Hamnet in a kind of liminal stage-like forest space. It's very dark, it's an uncanny world, and it mirrors both the woods near Agnes's home and the bare boards of a theater. And in the ending, the movie cuts between Hamlet's death at the Globe and Hamnet in that otherworldly space. And we see him moving towards a dark opening that echoes the cave-like hall Agnes saw earlier. So Agnes is able to see him, her son, smiling and walking into that darkness, and understands that this is a kind of passage. It's also a visual callback, but it's also a spiritual one, because the movie is essentially saying art brought him back, art finally let her say goodbye, and art is the language William uses for grief when he can't speak it aloud. There's also one more crucial detail in the film. William himself plays the ghost of Hamlet's father. So on stage, he's the dead father speaking to the living son, and off stage, he's the father who lost a son. So that double casting is the film's big, quiet thesis about how he has taken Hamlet's death into his own body and work. Now, in Maggie O'Farrell's novel, Agnes also travels to London and goes to the play. And the climax is still her watching Hamlet, but there it's framed almost entirely inside her head, because she realizes Shakespeare has reversed the tragedy, because in the play, the father dies instead of the son. In her reading of this, he has taken on the death so that Hamlet can symbolically live. And the novel's ending is internal because it's Agnes interpreting the play and putting the pieces together emotionally and intellectually. The movie, on the other hand, externalizes that. So it turns Agnes's realization into a visual catharsis because we see her see Hamnet again in that liminal space. We see her watch her husband as the ghost. We see the audience rise with her in grief, and we see her sorrow move from paralysis into something more like a release. Now let's talk history, what we actually know versus what is pure speculation, because the facts are much thinner than you'd actually expect. So here's a short version of what we do know. So William Shakespeare and his wife, historically Anne Hathaway, though O'Farrell and the film uses Agnes, the name that was actually recorded in her father's will. Now they had 3 children, Susanna, then the twins Hamnet and Judith. Now Hamnet was buried in Stratford on August 11th, 1596, at around 11 years old. So the parish record lists the burial, but not the cause of death. Now, we also know there were outbreaks of the plague in the 1590s, so many scholars suspect that some form of pestilence might have been the cause. However, that is more guesswork and not a documented fact. Another thing we know is that Shakespeare was spending much of his time in London with his acting company during these years, so it's very possible he wasn't home when Hamnet died. And we also know about 4 years later, around the 1600s, 1601, he wrote Hamlet. So that's it. That's the entire paper trail that we have. But the timing is so emotionally loaded. A son dies, then a play about a grieving son appears. People have been connecting these dots for centuries. And Maggie O'Farrell uses that connection as the spine of her novel. And Chloe Zhao built an entire film around it. Now, it's noteworthy to say that O'Farrell even points out in her author's note in the book and in interviews since that time that the Black Plague, the pestilence, is almost never named outright in Shakespeare's plays or his poetry. And that's interesting because when you look back at that time, we see how much it shaped his world back then. So for her, that absence becomes the imaginative spark for Hamnet. And it's looking at the situation of what if he poured all that grief and everything he was seeing somewhere else instead. So when we see Agnes in the Globe at the end of the movie, watching Hamlet mourn his father and listening to the ghost ask to be remembered, it really hits you differently once you know this timeline. Now, this might not be how Shakespeare himself processed the death of his child. I mean, not through letters because none of those survived, not through journals because we don't have any, but maybe it survived through performance, through story and language, big enough to really share his pain. So that's the emotional reality the book and the movie both tap into, even though the historical record itself is mostly silent. Now, let's talk about the adaptation, because there are 6 major differences between the book and the movie that completely alter how this story feels. From whose point of view we follow, how the story is structured, how mystical Agnes is, how the marriage is portrayed, and how the playwriting works, and of course, how the ending is framed. Now, the first difference is Agnes as the protagonist versus the shared point of view, because in the novel, Agnes is the clear protagonist. Her interiority drives everything. We are in her body, we have her memories, we have her grief. We watch her read people's natures through touch, move through the natural world, and navigate a kind of sixth sense about illness and fate. Shakespeare as a character is almost small by design. He is the husband as opposed to her just being the wife. He's often off stage and a man we primarily glimpse through her perceptions. Now, the film, on the other hand, splits the point of view more evenly. Agnes is still central, but William's arc is expanded. We spend more time in London inside the theatrical world and inside his ambitions, his anxieties, and his creative process. And Paul Mescal's performance really gives us a Shakespeare who is emotionally blocked, but more visibly torn between family and art. And I think that shift really matters, because in the book, Agnes's story is about living with loss and how it reshapes her. Whereas the movie is more of a shared story about how 2 parents and an artist metabolize the same loss, but in very different ways. Now, the second major difference is that the novel is more non-linear versus the film that follows a straight line, because the structure is a really big thing to talk about. In the book, we begin right at the crisis. Hamnet is searching for help for Judith because she's not doing well. And then the narrative jumps back in time to Agnes and William's courtship, and then forward and then back again, and it loops and it layers context around the central tragedy. There's even a whole interlude tracing the journey of the plague, bearing a flea from the Mediterranean to Warwickshire to Hamnet's illness being the gravitational center, and just the time that orbits around all of that. Now, the movie proceeds in a mostly linear line. It starts with Agnes and Will Will first meeting. It moves through their courtship, moves through their marriage, them having children, Hamlet's death, and then the creation and performance of Hamlet the play. So instead of jumping back and forth in time, the director decides to get that same doubling effect by cross-cutting between the everyday world and Hamlet's stage-like space. So that structural change quietly shifts who feels like the center of the tragedy. So in the book, Hamlet is the core. Everything circles his illness and death. Whereas the movie's structure, Agnes's and William's relationship is more central, and what Hamlet's loss does to it is really what shares the center of gravity in the film. Now, the next change is the one I think book readers maybe be saddest about, or maybe it's just me because I wanted more. And the third difference is Agnes and just how mystical she is in the book versus on screen. Now, in the novel, Agnes has a very almost mystical ability. She can sense things, she can read people, and she's always feeling for something beneath the surface. It's really presented as a real gift and part of the folklore around her as a forest witch figure. Now, the film keeps this in there. However, I do believe they toned it down. It wasn't as explicit, but we do see her herbal knowledge front and center. We see her sensitivity, we see her connections to the woods, and a few vision-like moments. But again, I think they're grounded in more emotional realism than treated as an outright gift or magic. So yes, we still get the bees, we still get the plants, we get the forest imagery, but on screen, it plays more like, intuition as opposed to something that is innate. But again, let me know your thoughts in the comments, especially if you've read the book, about how do you feel they portrayed Agnes. Another major difference is how they portrayed their courtship and their marriage. Now, the book spends a lot of time on the sensual, earthy roots of Agnes and William's relationship. We see their early connection is very physical as well as emotional, and it's tied to bodies, feels, seasons, and all the things. And O'Farrell is also very clear that later on, William has affairs in London, and Agnes senses other women in his absence and imagines them pressing against her bed curtains after Hamlet's death. So their marriage is loving, but it's very messy and complicated. Now, the film softens this picture. The romance, yes, it's still intense, but it leans harder into the emotional and spiritual connection, and it doesn't dwell on the infidelity. Because when we see Mescal's version of Will, he reads as a more faithful husband than the historical Shakespeare probably was, and definitely a lot more faithful than O'Farrell's novel suggests. And I think that choice was done to pull the focus away from the betrayal and keep the spotlight very tightly on the grief and the love and the art. So I'm not saying it's a flaw to do that, it's just more of a tonal decision. But it matters for how we understand their bond and what exactly has to be healed by the time we get to the Globe. Another major difference is the playwriting process, because in the novel, Hamlet as a text mostly happens off stage. We hear about the play and we see its impact on Agnes, but the act of writing feels like a very private, almost invisible working through grief kind of thing. And O'Farrell is more interested in the emotional consequences than showing them Shakespeare at work, Shakespeare at his desk. So the film brings the playwriting and the theatre world forward. We see more of Shakespeare's London life, the acting company, the rehearsals, the backstage tensions, and the pressure he's under to make this work. We also see him shaping scenes, taking on the ghost role, and channeling his feeling into the work. So that makes the movie more explicitly about Shakespeare as an artist at work, not just the husband who happened to leave, without ever quite letting him overshadow Agnes. And of course, another major difference we do have to talk about is the ending and how it is framed and what it really means. Because I think that's one of the biggest changes of all, and it's how the ending lands. Because in the book, the climax is Agnes reading the play from inside. So yes, she travels to London, she's in the theatre, and initially she feels confused and angry that this tragedy is named after her son and seems completely unrelated to their real child. But then the ghost enters, and then the young prince appears, and she realizes what her husband has done. He has written a story where the father dies and the son lives, and he has, in her words, changed places with Hamnet. So it's an interior interpretive climax. The drama is in her mind and her heart as she rereads her marriage and her son through this performance. Because we live so deeply inside her perspective on the page, the ending feels like her reclaiming of her son's death. She chooses to see Hamlet as an act of love and a husband taking on the death so the son can symbolically live. The movie, on the other hand, translates that realization into a visual and ritualistic experience. Because as we've seen, we don't just hear Agnes think, we watch her. We see William on stage as the ghost. We see her watch a boy who looks like Hamnet play Hamlet. And we see Agnes reach out as Hamlet dies and feel the entire audience surge with her. And we see Hamnet in that in-between world walking towards the dark opening. So the film's version is that grief is a language and different people speak it differently. Because Agnes grieves in her body, in the earth, in ritual and vision, and through her daily life. William, on the other hand, grieves in story, in metaphor, in performance. So watching Hamlet, Agnes finally sees that, you know what, he's been grieving all along, just not in a way she could recognize before. So through the play, he gives Hamnet a kind of immortality. So in this case, the book, the ending is more interior, more interpretive, almost, essayistic-ish, and Agnes quietly decides what the story of this loss will be. However, the movie's ending, it's exterior, it's embodied, it's communal, because grief becomes a shared ritual that finally lets her say goodbye and let go. But let me know in the comments, which version hit you harder? Did you prefer the book's interpretation of the ending or movie? And I kind of think it really depends on what you might prefer, because some people might be drawn to Agnes's interior world on the page, or maybe they enjoyed the shared experience of theater on screen. Now we have to get into the parallels and Easter eggs between Hamnet and Hamlet the play, because there are 3 key connections that I think theater nerds will lose their minds over in a good way. Easter egg and parallel number 1, the ghost. Remember in the film, William himself plays the ghost? So when Agnes enters the globe and sees the ghost appear, it echoes Hamlet's first confrontation with his father's spirit. Both scenes center a character watching someone they thought was gone, but return in a new form. So for Agnes, she's simultaneously seeing her husband perform a dead father and feeling the absence of her own dead child. Easter egg and parallel number 2, the casting. I think using the 2 Jupe brothers, Jacoby as Hamnet and Noah as Hamlet, is an intentional mirror. It blurs the line between the real boy and the fictional prince. And for Agnes, there is no clean separation. She's watching her son and a character at the same time. The camera really leans into that resemblance, so we experience the doubling that she does. Easter egg and parallel number 3, the play within a play. Because in Hamlet, the prince stages a play to reveal the truth about his father's murder. He uses performance to drag hidden guilt into the light. And in Hamnet, Agnes watches a play to reveal the truth about her husband's grief. So in both stories, theater isn't just entertainment, it's like an X-ray, because performance is how hidden emotions and secrets come to the surface. And of course, that final reach when Hamlet dies and Agnes instinctively reaches out her hand, it really echoes her earlier moments as a mother reaching for Hamnet. And it visually ties into the shots of Hamnet reaching toward that stage, like the forest doorway. It turns that ending into a loop, a retelling, and also a second chance at goodbye. And I think these are the kinds of choices that really reward you if you know Hamlet, but still the movie makes them emotionally legible even if you don't. Now let's get into whether you should read the book, watch the movie, or do both. Now here's my quick guide. If you want atmospheric, interior, historical fiction where grief moves like weather and character is everything, you need to read the book. You'll live inside Agnes's mind, her body, her strange gifts, and you'll get the full force of O'Farrell's language. Now, if you're curious about Shakespeare, but you're intimidated by the language, or you want to experience the emotional spine of the story in a more visual and immediate way, watch the movie. The performances, the staging of the globe, and the final sequence do a lot of the heavy lifting for you. But of course, if you want that full emotional impact and all the layers, do both. Read Hamnet and live inside Agnes for a while. Then watch how the film translates that into performance and images. And if you want to go all in, read or watch Hamlet afterwards and notice all the echoes. And tell me in the comments, what is your order of attack? Are you going to read the book first, the movie first, Hamlet next, or you're going full trilogy like I did? So there you have it. That's Hamnet, the ending explained, the history we actually have, and a deep dive into the book versus movie versus reality. So if you love adaptation breakdowns and you want more, check out my Wicked for Good movie breakdown that is available now here on the channel, because I really get into the original novel, the Broadway musical, the new movie, and of course the 1939 Wizard of Oz. And coming up next in adaptations is The Housemaid. This is a wildly entertaining thriller that is an adaptation of Frida McFadden's novel and series of the same name. So if you haven't already, now's a great time to like the video, hype the video, and subscribe to the channel. I post new videos every week and I go live every Thursday. So happy reading, happy watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye for now.